The snow was falling thick, the kind that erased the horizon and swallowed the edges of the world. Eleanor May stood at her cabin door with a lantern raised high, the yellow flame a trembling island against the storm. The glass rattled with the wind, and her shawl clung to her shoulders like a second skin, wet through with sleet. She told herself she was only out to check the latch, but in truth she lingered because silence weighed heavier than cold. The house behind her was too empty, too still. A widow's cabin with walls that listened to nothing but her own breathing. Her husband had been gone nearly a year, taken by fever that came with the first frost. The neighbors had said she was cursed, a beauty too sharp for God's kindness, and now whispers carried farther than kindness ever did. Every time she rode into town for flour or lamp oil, she felt the eyes, heard the titter behind palms. She can't keep a man alive. She talks too sweet to shadows. She'll beg before spring. Shame clung worse than the storm, and she could not shake it. The horses in her barn had grown restless tonight, their cries rising against the wind, and it was that sound that pulled her outside, lantern in hand. She feared wolves. Winter always drove them down from the ridges, and though she had a rifle propped by the door, her hands were unsteady on the stock. The snow bit into her cheeks as she stepped down from the porch, boots crunching until she froze. Movement, dark against white, shaped itself near the barnyard fence. At first her heart stuttered with terror, imagining gray backs and yellow eyes. But then the figure straightened, tall, broad-shouldered, the outline of a man. He was shirtless, though the night was bitter. Black hair hung heavy and damp down his spine, and the light from her lantern struck across the ridges of muscle like carving through stone. In one hand he held a crude spear, nothing more than a branch whittled sharp. At his feet lay the carcass of a wolf, blood steaming where it stained the snow. 3 others lay scattered near the fence line, their bodies still and dark, evidence of the violence she had only just missed hearing. The horses quieted in the barn as if they, too, knew the danger was gone. Her mouth went dry. She knew him by reputation alone. Dakota, the mountain Apache. Stories circled of his presence in the hills, seen sometimes by hunters or ranchers too far from the road. They called him savage, wild, the remnant of a people who had once roamed free before fences and rifles hemmed them in. But here he was, standing bare to the storm, his breath a cloud of heat, his eyes fixed on her. Not cruel eyes, but steady, unreadable, as if weighing something far beyond her understanding. Eleanor gripped the lantern tighter, throat working. Why are you here?" she asked, though her voice hardly carried above the wind. It seemed foolish the moment she said it. The wolves answered for him, and the silence that followed was heavier than words. He did not move toward her, nor away. He stood as though the storm meant nothing, as though her presence were no intrusion. She noticed then the scars across his chest, pale lines that crossed like roads on a map, and the faint tremor of exhaustion in his stance. He had fought, perhaps long before he reached her fence. He had bled and endured more winters than she could imagine. Something broke inside her, not in fear but in the fragile shell she had been holding against loneliness. Here was a man abandoned by the world as she was. Here was another soul with no fire to return to, no voice to call him home. She felt shame at the thought, shame for noticing the raw power of his body when her own heart still carried grief, but she could not tear her gaze away. The snow thickened, spiraling like ash from a funeral pyre. She realized her lantern was sputtering low, oil near spent, and still she lingered at the doorway. "Come in," she whispered, though she did not know if he understood her tongue. The words were thin, nearly torn by the wind. "At least for the storm." His head tilted, and his dark eyes caught the flicker of light. For a heartbeat she thought he would turn and vanish into the white, leaving her with wolves and silence again. That thought struck her with more fear than the animals had. The idea of the night swallowing him, while she returned to her cold bed, seemed unbearable. The words slipped out before she could stop them, shameful in their nakedness. "I don't live alone anymore. Please stay with me." Her breath froze the moment she spoke them, and her eyes burned with regret. What must she sound like? A desperate widow begging a stranger? What judgment would the town heap upon her if they knew? She nearly lowered the lantern in defeat. But Dakota's gaze did not sharpen with scorn. Instead, he shifted the spear to his side and began walking toward her, each step sinking deep into the drifts. His silence was not rejection but something else, something older, heavier, as though words had long ago failed him. When he reached the porch, the lantern light spread across his face. He was younger than she expected, though the lines carved by hardship made him seem carved from older stone. His jaw was set, lips pale from cold, but his eyes, those eyes carried a steadiness that no storm could shake. He paused at the threshold, snow melting off his shoulders, dripping onto the boards. For a moment he looked past her into the cabin's dim light, into the narrow walls and lonely hearth. Then he looked at her, and she felt as though he saw the truth she had buried beneath silence. Her fear, her shame, her aching hunger not for food, but for another human presence. She stepped back, her hand trembling as she held the door wide. The lantern flame sputtered and steadied, casting shadows across the walls. He ducked slightly as he entered, his body filling the space like a shadow carved from the storm itself. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them both, though his skin still glistened with frost. Eleanor closed the door against the wind, her back pressing to the wood as her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. The sound of silence returned, but it was not empty now. It was charged, alive, carrying the weight of something unknown. He set the spear aside gently, leaning it against the wall, then stood in the center of her small home as though waiting. Waiting for her to decide what came next. Waiting to see if her words had been true. Her heart thundered so loudly she feared he could hear it. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, to take back the begging tone of her plea. But no words came. She only looked at him, at the quiet power he carried without pride, and realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within her. The lantern guttered once more, shadows sweeping over his face, leaving his eyes the last steady thing in the room. She could not read them fully, only feel the gravity they carried. And in that gravity, she knew something had shifted. Her world was no longer empty. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters. Inside, the silence deepened. Dakota stood still, the storm dripping from his shoulders, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she realized she had invited into her home not just a man, but the weight of all that the world outside would not forgive. And the night had only just begun. The storm had thinned by morning, though the sky still sagged gray and heavy over the town. Eleanor May wrapped her shawl tight and led her mare down the rutted road, the saddle empty, the bags at her hip light. She needed flour, a coil of wick for the lantern, and the comfort of being among others, though comfort was never what she found. Snow crunched under hooves and boots, and her breath carried ahead of her like smoke from a dying fire. The general store bell gave a brittle ring as she pushed the door. Heat met her from the iron stove, but so did stares. 2 ranch wives stood near the bins of dried beans, their whispers slicing the air sharper than the wind outside. Eleanor lowered her gaze, but she caught enough. Apache in her cabin. Widow's shame. Doesn't fear God. Martha Calloway was among them, sharp-eyed, lips painted by frostbite into something crueler than nature intended. She leaned against the counter, her voice loud enough for every corner to hear. "Well, if it ain't Miss Eleanor May. Heard you've got company in that lonely cabin of yours." The words landed like stones, and Eleanor's face burned though the room was cold. She placed her coins on the counter, her voice a whisper when she asked for flour. The shopkeeper hesitated, glancing toward Martha before filling her sack. The pause said more than any sermon could. Town judgment always moved in silence first, before it found its voice. Outside, Eleanor held the reins tighter, the mare shifting restless beneath her touch. She heard the women's laughter spill into the street, brittle and hard. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, to tell them the truth. That a man had saved her horses, that his silence was a shield, not a sin. But her throat closed. Words, once loosed, could not be gathered back. Better to endure. Better to keep her dignity quiet, even if it weighed heavier than lead. The sheriff found her halfway down Main Street. Harlan was a tall man, hair gone silver at the temples, his mustache carrying the shape of a frown, even when he did not speak. He touched his hat brim in greeting, though his eyes narrowed in study. "Morning, Eleanor. Folks are talkin' to." She stiffened. "Folks always talk." His jaw worked slowly. This talk's different. They say you're harboring an Apache. That true?" Her silence was answer enough. Harlan sighed, his breath a white cloud. "You know how it looks. People already been restless. One man's presence can spark something ugly if the tinder's dry enough." Eleanor lifted her chin though her heart thudded. "He's done nothing but help me. He kept wolves from tearing down my barn. If kindness is crime, then maybe the law needs mending." The sheriff studied her a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't make the laws of men's hearts, Eleanor. I only keep blood from spilling. Don't let it come to that." He walked on, boots crunching in the snow, leaving her with the taste of fear sharp as iron on her tongue. By the time she reached her cabin, dusk had begun to dim the snowfields. The smoke from her chimney curled into the sky, a fragile line that marked her home. Inside, Dakota knelt by the hearth, coaxing flame from kindling he had split that morning. His body moved with quiet rhythm, deliberate, as if every motion held ceremony. She laid the sack of flour on the table and watched him. He did not look up, but she felt he knew everything anyway. The whispers, the sheriff's warning, the way her heart still rattled in her chest. "I went to town," she said softly, removing her shawl. "They think you're danger. They think I've lost what little virtue I had." Her voice caught, brittle as ice. Dakota fed another stick to the fire, the crackle answering in place of words. His silence was neither agreement nor dismissal. It was a weight, grounding her. He finally lifted his gaze, eyes dark as river stone, and inclined his head once, as though he understood more than language could carry. Eleanor drew a breath. "I don't know if I can endure their stares again. Every step I take in that street feels like I'm walking naked." Still, he said nothing. But when he rose, he crossed to the door, tightened the latch against the wind, and returned to the fire. A simple act. Yet it steadied her more than all her husband's sermons had when he lived. Later, as the snow thickened once again, Eleanor placed bread before him on the table. He did not reach for it immediately, as though unsure it was meant for him. She pressed it closer, her hand brushing the scarred skin of his knuckles. His eyes softened, and finally, he broke the crust and ate. The sound of bread cracking was louder than the storm. That night, she sat by the window while he tended the fire. The lantern light painted his profile in bronze and shadow, the muscles of his shoulders moving slow, patient. She found herself watching, not out of fear but of something deeper, something that startled her when she named it. Safety. Her own reflection in the glass startled her. A woman with tired eyes, but no longer hollow. Something in her face had shifted, though she could not yet name it. The wind carried voices outside then, faint but sharp. She rose and pressed her ear to the wall. Men's voices. Their laughter was not merry but edged with mockery. She caught fragments. Her name, Dakota's, the word shame. Dakota heard it too. He stilled, every line of his body taut, but he did not move toward the door. He simply looked at her, letting her choose. Her heart pounded. She lifted her chin, and though her voice trembled, she said, "Let them talk." He nodded once. A quiet pact forged between them in silence. But the voices did not pass quickly. They lingered. Men circling like wolves that had not been driven far enough. One of them shouted, "Smoke's too thick from that chimney. Something foul in there." Their laughter scattered across the snow. Eleanor's breath hitched, fear clawing back up her throat. She turned toward the fire, its glow trembling across the walls, and for the first time she wished it burned lower, hidden from sight. The sound of horses shifted, hooves dragging, men refusing to move on. Dakota's hand tightened on the spear by the door. Eleanor pressed her palm over his wrist, her own shaking. The warmth of his skin steadied her as she whispered, "Not tonight. Please." The laughter outside faded at last, carried off with the wind, but the silence they left behind was heavier than their noise. Eleanor sank into her chair, every muscle trembling with release. Dakota returned to the fire, leaning the spear against the wall again. The crackle filled the room, but the echo of judgment lingered like smoke. Eleanor stared into the flames, her eyes wet, knowing the world outside her walls was no longer content to whisper. It was watching, circling. And it would come back. Snow deepened across the valley. piling against fences and swallowing trails, until the world looked like a single blank page. Days folded into one another, marked only by the sound of an axe striking wood or the pop of sap bursting in the fire. Within the cabin, life found a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Dakota had planned, a rhythm that felt older than either of them. In the mornings, he rose before dawn. She would stir awake to the crunch of boots outside and find, by the time the first light pressed against the shutters, a stack of split logs neatly waiting by the hearth. When she tried once to take the axe from him, her hands trembling with effort against the weight, he shook his head. His silence was not dismissive but protective, a quiet boundary set without words. She learned to respect it, though some part of her ached with shame that she could give so little back. Still, she found ways. When he returned from the woods with snow dusting his shoulders, she would place bread on the table, or stew if she had enough beans to stretch. She would sit across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of her bowl, and watch him eat slowly, methodically, as though each bite was not taken for pleasure but for duty. He rarely lifted his gaze while he ate, but when he did it was steady, almost reverent. Those brief moments carried more weight than hours of talk. Eleanor began to notice small things. The way he paused at the window each evening, scanning the horizon before settling by the fire. The way his scarred hands moved with unexpected gentleness when repairing the latch or mending the harness strap. He never hurried. Every action was deliberate, as though he honored each thing with the time it deserved. She realized she had lived years rushing, filling silence with chatter, filling absence with work, never still enough to feel life press against her. Now, in his silence, she felt the press of everything. Old Jonah came one afternoon, his limp dragging through the drifts, his breath huffing white in the air. Eleanor met him at the door, anxious, but Jonah only tipped his hat, and let his weathered eyes wander past her shoulder to the tall figure bent over the fire. He said nothing cruel, only nodded once and handed her a sack of oats. "Keep warm, child," he murmured, his gaze softer than most. She wondered if he saw what others refused, that loneliness bound her and Dakota tighter than any vow could. But town judgment did not sleep. Riders passed more often along the ridge, their shadows stretching against the snow, their laughter breaking the stillness. Once, a stone clattered against the cabin wall. Eleanor flinched, heart pounding, but Dakota did not move. He remained by the fire, his expression unchanged. Only later, when she thought he slept, did she notice his hand resting near the spear, fingers curled tight. The bond between them grew not in words but in gestures. One evening, she sat at the table with her sewing, her thread snapping again and again. Frustration welled, tears hot in her eyes. Dakota took the cloth gently from her hands, threaded the needle in a single motion, and set it back before her without a word. She stared, then laughed through the ache, a laugh she had not heard from her own lips in months. He did not smile, but something softened around his eyes, as though the sound itself gave him peace. Nights were the hardest. The storm howled against the roof, pressing like fists against the shutters, and she would lie awake listening. Once she rose, unable to bear the emptiness of her bed, and found him sitting by the dying fire. His back was straight, his eyes fixed on the coals. She hesitated, shame twisting in her stomach, then sat a few feet away, wrapping her shawl tight. They did not speak, but she felt the air shift between them, as though sharing silence was a kind of promise. It was then she began to braid her hair again in the mornings. Not for vanity, but because the act itself felt like reclaiming something. She caught her reflection in the frosted window, and did not see only grief. She saw a woman who still lived, still carried warmth enough to be seen. That realization startled her more than any gossip. Still, fear clung close. One evening as she fed the fire, she asked softly, "Why do you stay?" Her voice trembled at the edge of shame. He looked at her, expression unreadable, then placed another log on the flames. The crackle answered in place of words. She wanted to press further, but the quiet dignity in his stillness stopped her. Perhaps the question itself was enough. As days passed, her shame shifted into something else. Where once she cowered from the town's whispers, now she began to feel defiance flicker inside her. When the men rode past, she no longer hid by the window. She stood tall, watching until their eyes flicked away. Takota's presence gave her a kind of armor, though he never raised a hand or voice against them. His stillness was a shield, and behind it she found a strength she thought had died with her husband. One evening, as dusk bled red across the snow, she stood outside the cabin to draw water from the well. The air was sharp, biting her skin raw, but she held her head high. Behind her, she heard the crunch of boots. Takota emerged, bare-chested against the cold, carrying an armful of wood. For a moment she saw them as the town must, a widow and an Apache, standing side by side in the snow. But instead of shame, she felt something fierce rise in her chest. Not pride exactly, but dignity, fragile yet unbroken. The sky darkened quickly, stars needling through the clouds. She turned to him, wanting to speak, to tell him that his presence was remaking her in ways she barely understood. But before she could find the words, the sound of hooves broke the silence. From the ridge above, voices carried, coarse, mocking, sharpened by drink. "There's the witch and her savage," one man jeered, his laughter ringing down the slope. Another voice followed. "Torch'll cure what's foul in that house." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Her hand tightened on the bucket rope, frozen against the well. Takota's eyes narrowed, his body still as stone, but she saw the spear within easy reach at the door. The riders paused, silhouettes dark against the snowy horizon. Their laughter grew louder, crueler, echoing into the valley, as though testing how far their cruelty could reach. Eleanor's breath came shallow, and her heart thudded with dread. Takota did not move, but his presence beside her was like a wall. The voices carried, circling, daring, promising. And in that moment, Eleanor knew the whispers had turned into something darker. The town was no longer content to speak of her. It was preparing to act. The storm came with fury, howling across the valley, as though the mountains themselves had loosed their grief. Snow lashed against the cabin walls, rattling shutters and burying the porch beneath white drifts. Eleanor pressed her hands to her skirts to still their trembling, every sound outside feeding the dread growing in her chest. She had known it would come, the whispers, the laughter, the circling shadows. Tonight they had returned, not as rumor but as fire. Through the cracks of the shutters, she saw torchlight burning against the storm. Men on horseback, their faces half hidden by scarves, their voices sharp as knives. They shouted her name, spat her shame into the night air. "Come out, widow. Send him out. Let us see the savage you're harboring." Their words crashed like stones against her fragile walls. Takota stood by the door, the spear gripped in his hand. The firelight from the hearth painted his chest bronze, muscles taut beneath the scars of older battles. His silence was heavier than the storm, a presence that filled the room until Eleanor could barely breathe. She wanted to beg him not to fight, but her throat caught. To speak felt like breaking something sacred, as though his stillness was the only thread keeping her from falling apart. The first rock struck the window, glass shattering, wind and snow rushing into the room. Eleanor cried out, covering her face as shards scattered across the floor. The torches outside hissed in the storm, their flames snapping like teeth. Voices roared, "Burn them out! Burn the shame clean!" Her heart lurched as she saw one torch arc through the dark and land against the wall of the cabin. Flames licked greedily at the wood, smoke curling into the night. Eleanor staggered back, tears burning her eyes, and turned to Takota. He was already moving, seizing a bucket, dousing the fire with snow scooped from the sill. His movements were swift, steady, unshaken. But another torch followed, crashing against the eaves. The storm and fire warred, sparks spraying, smoke stinging. Eleanor ran to the door, flung it open, and stood in the blizzard, her hair whipping loose, her shawl torn from her shoulders. Her voice rang high, cracked with desperation. "Stop! Please! He saved me when none of you would. He's done nothing but protect." The men laughed, cruel and merciless. Martha Calloway's voice rose above them all, shrill with venom. "Protect? You disgrace your husband's grave. You shame us all, begging at the feet of a savage." The words pierced deeper than the cold, sharper than glass. Eleanor's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall, her body between the mob and the cabin. Sheriff Harlan's horse pushed forward then, his voice cutting through the storm. Enough! You'll drive blood into the snow if you don't stand down. But even his authority trembled against the fire of their anger. The men pressed closer, the torches lowering. "Step aside, Sheriff," one growled. "If you won't rid this place of filth, we will." Dakota appeared in the doorway behind Eleanor, his shadow long against the snow. He held the spear in one hand, his chest bare to the storm, frost clinging to his hair. His voice came low, steady, carrying over the wind like the sound of earth breaking. "I leave, she dies." The words silenced even the storm for a heartbeat. Eleanor turned, stunned. It was the first time she had heard his voice shaped into her tongue. The truth of it rang through her body, undeniable. Her eyes burned with tears, not of shame but of something deeper, fear and awe tangled into one. The men muttered, shifting in their saddles, torches sputtering in the snow. The storm whipped harder, as if the sky itself resisted the violence about to break. Then one rider spurred forward, his face twisted with rage. "Savage lies! Burn them out!" He flung his torch, and it caught against the cabin's roof, fire blooming. Dakota moved then, not like a man but like a force of the storm itself. He strode into the snow, the spear flashing in the torchlight. With a single motion, he struck the torch from the rider's hand, sending embers scattering into the drifts. The horse reared, the man cursed, and chaos rippled through the mob. Eleanor screamed for them to stop, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Sheriff Harlan fired his pistol into the air, the crack splitting the night. "Enough!" He roared again, though his words barely held the men back. They circled still, faces twisted by fury and drink, their shadows long across the snow. Martha's voice shrieked once more from the edge of the crowd. "She chose her shame, let her burn with it." The men surged, emboldened. Another rock hurtled toward the cabin, striking near the door, wood splintering. Eleanor's legs gave way, and she fell to her knees in the snow, her palms sinking into the drifts. She looked up at them, at faces she had known since childhood, faces twisted now by cruelty, and she cried out, her voice raw. "If you strike him, you strike me too. I will not move." The storm pressed harder, snow blinding, torches sputtering in the wind. Dakota stood over her, spear ready, his breath steaming, his eyes aflame not with anger but with resolve. He was a wall against the fury of the world, and she, kneeling in the snow, was no longer alone in her defiance. The men hesitated, their courage faltering against her cry. For the first time, Eleanor saw uncertainty ripple across their faces. Yet the fire still smoldered on the cabin roof, smoke curling, flames licking higher. Dakota reached down and lifted Eleanor from the snow, as though she weighed no more than a child. She gasped, clutching his shoulder, the storm tearing at her hair. His eyes never left the men, his silence more powerful than their shouts. He carried her toward the cabin, back into the fire's shadow. The mob pressed closer, anger renewed by the sight. One man shouted, "He'll never leave. We'll all burn for her sin." The horses stamped, torches flared, the storm screamed. The night was a crucible, fire and snow warring over the valley. Inside the cabin, smoke thickened, sparks falling onto the floor. Dakota set Eleanor down gently, then turned back toward the door, spear in hand, ready to meet whatever storm came through it. His silhouette filled the frame, broad, unyielding, framed in firelight and snow. Eleanor clutched the table for balance, her chest heaving. She saw him there, a man caught between worlds, carrying the weight of both her salvation and her ruin. And she knew, this night would decide everything. The wind roared, the torches flared, the cabin walls groaned with fire. And as Dakota stepped into the threshold, spear raised, the storm broke open in full fury. The fire hissed where snow smothered it, but smoke still curled black against the night sky. Eleanor clung to the doorframe, breath ragged, watching Dakota step into the storm. His body was bare to the wind, muscles trembling with cold and strain, spear poised. The men circled on horseback, their torches sputtering in the blizzard, their shouts cutting like blades. The storm roared, swallowing sound, but fear still reached her, hot and sharp in her chest. Sheriff Harlan's horse pressed through the snow, his pistol raised high. "Back down!" he bellowed, the wind tearing his voice. No blood tonight. But the mob had already lost itself. Faces hard with drink and hatred leaned from the saddles, torches lowering toward the cabin. Dakota planted his feet in the drifts, spear firm in his grip. His silence was more commanding than any shout. When the first rider charged, torch swinging, Dakota moved with startling grace, striking the torch from the man's hand. Flames burst against the snow, dying in an instant. The horse reared, throwing its rider into the dark. Another rushed, club raised, but Dakota sidestepped, using only the butt of his spear to knock the weapon free. His movements were not those of rage but of precision, every strike meant to end without killing. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with awe. He could have slaughtered them. Yet each blow was measured, controlled. He fought not for blood but for space, for her. And as she watched, shame fell away from her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The mob faltered, their courage cracking as man after man found himself disarmed, thrown from saddles, torches dead in the snow. Dakota never spoke, never boasted. His silence was thunder. His stillness between blows was more terrible than fury. Martha Calloway's voice screeched from the ridge, shrill with panic. "Cowards! You let him shame you! Burn them!" But her words found no roots. The men glanced at one another, their breaths loud in the storm, their bravado unraveling. Then the roof of the cabin groaned, sparks glowing in the night. Eleanor gasped as fire licked higher, threatening to consume the home that had held her grief, her loneliness, and now her fragile hope. Without hesitation, she tore free from the doorway, seized the bucket, and plunged it into the snow. She flung water over the flames, coughing on smoke, her arms trembling. Again and again she fought the fire, while Dakota held the men at bay. At last, Sheriff Harlan spurred forward, his pistol cracking into the air once more. "Enough," I said. His voice rang with finality, the kind that came not from law but from exhaustion, from years of watching hatred devour men. He turned his horse toward Martha, eyes hard. "You've stirred enough poison. Go home." For a long moment, the storm carried only the hiss of fire and the ragged breath of men. Then, slowly, the mob broke. One rider turned his horse. Another followed, muttering into the wind. Soon torches were cast aside, hissing into the snow, shadows dissolving into the white night. Martha's voice shrilled one last curse before she vanished into the storm. Silence fell heavy. The storm raged on, but the valley itself seemed to exhale. Eleanor collapsed to her knees in the snow, arms weak, lungs burning. The cabin smoldered but still stood. And beside her, Dakota lowered the spear, his chest heaving, eyes steady as stone. Sheriff Harlan dismounted, his boots crunching close. He looked between them, at the widow kneeling in the snow, at the Apache standing guard above her. For a moment, his face softened. "You've weathered more than most towns can name," he said quietly. "They won't forgive easy. But they won't forget either." He touched his hat and turned away, vanishing into the storm with his horse. The night was theirs again. Eleanor pressed her palms into the snow, her body trembling with exhaustion and release. Dakota reached down, lifting her with a gentleness that broke her heart more than any cruelty had. She met his eyes and for the first time, she did not look away. Inside the cabin, smoke still curled in the rafters, but the fire was beaten. Dakota set the spear aside, his movements slow now, weariness heavy in his limbs. Eleanor sank into the chair by the hearth, tears sliding silent down her cheeks. He crouched before her, his scarred hands rough against her trembling ones. No words passed, but the silence was full, alive, carrying more promise than vows. The storm softened near dawn. Light bled across the horizon, pale gold spilling over the snowfields. Eleanor stepped outside, shawl wrapped tight, and watched the valley gleam with new day. Dakota stood beside her, his breath rising in steady clouds, his eyes fixed on the ridges. For the first time, she felt the weight of his presence not as shame but as strength. She had begged him to stay, and he had. Not only through the night, but through fire and fury, through judgment and storm. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "I'm not alone anymore." The words drifted into the morning like a prayer, fragile yet unbroken. Dakota's hand brushed against hers, a touch so light it could have been the wind. Still, she felt it in her bones. The valley stirred with silence, the storm's fury spent. The world had not forgiven, but it had yielded, if only for a moment. And in that moment, Eleanor stood with dignity reclaimed. Her shame burned away with the torches that had tried to destroy her. The cabin behind them bore its scars, blackened wood and broken glass, but it still stood. Like her. Like him. The sun broke over the ridge, fierce and unyielding, casting them both in gold. And for the first time since her husband's death, Eleanor felt not only alive but seen. Seen by a man who asked for nothing, yet gave her everything. The wind eased, carrying away the last echoes of cruelty. What remained was a silence neither empty nor afraid. The dawn belonged to them. And somewhere deep within, Eleanor understood. Love was not always spoken, nor swiftly claimed. Sometimes it was forged in fire and snow, in silence and shame, until it stood unshaken against the storm. The light grew brighter, warming her face, and she let it wash her clean. She glanced once more at Dakota, his silhouette strong against the rising sun, and she knew the world would judge them still. But their dignity could not be taken, not now, not ever. The storm had tried to erase them. Instead, it had revealed who they were. And in that revelation, their story had only just begun.